So one of the things that our reading for this week focuses on is the emergence of territory, and I wanted just to speak to that a little bit if I could in the following few slides. Um, we've talked about the Greek city-states, we've talked about the Roman Empire, the transition through the Holy Roman Empire into the era of Westphalia. We've even hinted at the emergence of globalization today. So we have something about the history of this sort of down now. But we still don't really sort of know exactly what it is we're talking about. What is this thing called territory? What drives it? You know, what in these various historical moments? What created this movement or shift from an ambiguous relation to territory to a concrete relationship with territory? That's what we're kind of going to focus in this part of the lecture, okay? And we have three different theories to look at. And again, look, I mean, as with every single one of these modules that we look at here, the question is the theories that they present. You know, are they costing us more than they're benefiting us? Really, that's what we're kind of after here, is an understanding of whether theory is useful in our effort to understand the problem, or whether theory is perhaps a hindrance. And of course, inevitably, it's going to be both, right? I don't think we're ever going to come to a final agreement on theory being universally good or bad. It probably is both. To go back to our original metaphor in terms of, you know, when back in the first module we talked about wearing different types of sunglasses. You know, they reveal different things about the world around us to us, and they also hide things. So the first theory that we look at, the first approach, is the political economic approach, which was developed by Karl Marx and people like him, who were interested in the emergence of capitalism. And so, writing from their historical perspective, what they were seeing, of course, was that there were tremendous things going on in terms of the changing pace of industry in their time, and the fact that people had been relocated from the countryside, where they had lived on the commons, moving into the urban slums. They had been forcibly relocated in many instances, kicked off the land, just around the time, of course, that the factories in the cities needed laborers. And so Marx and Engels and people like that were observing some of this, and they really came to the view that the state really existed only for one reason, and that was to serve the interests of the bourgeoisie. Who are the bourgeoisie, by the way? Well, the bourgeoisie are the townspeople, I guess is what the term literally means, but the bourgeoisie are actually, in Marx's view, the merchants, the capitalists, the people who own the means of production, and they are the ones who have the power over the nation state. So if the state exists at all, if it's for anyone, if it functions on behalf of anyone, it's the capitalists. And Marx says, in fairness, you know, look, these capitalists, they may talk a lot about the free market. They may advocate that the government be small. They may advocate lower taxes, all this sort of thing. But really, at the end of the day, while they talk against the state a lot, nothing that they do would be possible without the state, because markets are not possible. Markets are not possible at all without the state, without the centralized government that is able to distribute the laws and regulations of maintaining the state evenly over the land. You know, the state, says Marx, has other obligations as well that are quite clearly revealed as capitalism develops. Once we have welfare and things like this come along, all of that's very important. Welfare is not an anti-capitalist phenomena, after all, says Marx. Minimally, you need some kind of welfare there in order to keep the workers that are not currently employed in a state of health, so that they can be employed should the need emerge, right? So some people, from a capitalist perspective, when there's not enough jobs, are just going to be unemployed, says Marx. And they're standing by as a reserve army of labor, if you will. But that reserve army of labor needs to be kept healthy if it's to make it through, you know. So we talked about Bismarck before, you know, that's kind of the point that he was trying to raise as well, but that was a military point, I suppose. Here it's just in terms of industry. So we need to have healthcare, we need to have sanitation, sewage, etc., to prevent pandemics, epidemics in urban areas. These urban areas, as we've been saying, are kind of new. These cities, these suburbs didn't really exist before industrialization came along, certainly not to the extent that they did. So, you know, the government has to be there on behalf of the capitalists to make sure that all of that functions correctly. And that goes on, of course, says Marx, regardless of who's in power. You know, a capitalist country continues to function in this basic way, regardless of whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats, the Conservatives or the Liberals in power, because both parties are really capitalist at the end of the day. They're just different, sort of, they focus on it to different degrees. For Marx, you know, there wasn't really much point in talking about the difference between these political parties, because at the end of the day they added up to the same thing. They were both the party of big business. And hence the state then, territory is going to function as a sort of a extension of the logic of the property relations of the state. So moving along from the Marxist perspective, we have what we call in our textbook the political strategic approach, and here our key figure is not Marx but Foucault. Foucault, I have to say, I think is one of my personal favorite thinkers. Foucault is pictured here in the image. He sort of distanced himself a little bit from Marx in saying that the state is not a phenomena driven exclusively by the need of the proletariat, of the bourgeoisie. It's not capitalism at the end of the day that determines everything about the nation state. It's its own separate thing, right? That the state has its own separate logic, and that logic is caught up in what he calls biopolitics. There's all kinds of things that states are needed for. For example, military resources, other kinds of strategic resources, basically just keeping order. And in the task of keeping order, capitalism can be implicated, right? I mean, free markets are sometimes very useful in terms of maximizing the internal energy of the state. And actually, I think Foucault argues, and we don't need to get too much into this, but he argues that more recently, he's dead now some time, but towards the end of his career, he was making arguments that it looked like the logic of free markets had taken over the logic of the state, so to speak. But in the long, broad sweep of history that Foucault analyzes, his most important concept really is that of biopolitics, which is a politics of life. And biopolitics is the preoccupation of the nation state. Biopolitics, speaks to and symbolizes the need of the modern nation state, which has all these new technologies coming on board for mapping, methods of statistical measurement, etc., that the state can basically ascertain much more concretely the nature of the life that it governs. And as it narrates and as it tries to understand that life, it has to protect it, it has to nurture it, it has to bring it to fruition. So you see, it's very similar in a way to what Marx is saying, but it's not sort of hung up on this sort of idea that it's the bourgeoisie that are driving the whole thing. It's not class powers, but rather it's kind of an emerging modern science of the state, what Foucault actually calls, and this is a kind of a cool word, governmentality. So there, in that term, you have government, but you also have mentality. So governmentality, all one word, speaks to the kind of power-knowledge relations of the modern nation-state. Again, it's a theory that sort of ends up looking a little bit like Marx's theory, but it's not really necessarily a criticism of capitalism. And then finally, we have another related theory. We have the land-based approach, the technique-based approach, and here we have in the picture the cover of a book that I personally like very much by Davis Obel called Longitude, which is about Harrison, the man who invented the the watch that could assist explorers navigate their way around the world, because of course it was a tremendous problem to be able to know where you were in the world if you didn't have a clock. So thousands of lives had been lost at sea, as we argue here, over the centuries due to the inability to determine an east-west position. To know how far east or west one had sailed, one would need to know one's speed over time. It's easy to know where you are if you know three things: total time of the journey, the local time, which you can tell from the sun, and the time you set out. So if you know the local time and you know the time of the sun at the time you set out, then the only thing missing really is the total time that you were traveling. And so to have an accurate clock was very, very important in that sense. And people didn't have it. People didn't have that at all until Harrison came along. So what does all this speak to? It speaks to the emergence of the territorial state as a phenomena of mapping, as a phenomena of knowledge to do with the land. This is kind of similar to Foucault, I think. I'm not sure why the author sort of necessarily sets this apart from biopolitics, but I guess I understand it. That he's trying to focus in on the kind of technologies and the techniques of measuring. And basically, I think he's saying, if Marx is saying that the state is born of capitalism, and Foucault is saying that the state is born of a biopolitical care and need to think about the population, then our author here is suggesting that the modern state is really impossible without the emergence of an understanding of the land that's really only available to us through the lens of modern mapping techniques. And as we've been talking about Harrison and the clock, you know, it's the ability to sort of grid out the planet, the ability to sort of make the planet make sense through the techniques of mapping that were becoming available. Some of these, the implication, and I guess where I go with this is I start to think about artwork again. You know, we've talked a lot about artwork in this class already, and in this famous painting here by Niccolò Mauruzi de Tolentino, sorry, I take that back. This is a painting by Paolo Uccello, and it's called Niccolò Mauruzi da Tolentino at the Battle of San Romano. And it's an interesting map because it speaks to this notion we've just been trying to talk about, the idea of a modern spatial imagination, or a modern way of thinking about the land. And you can't really have a state, goes the argument, until you have that modern understanding of land, that the land can be mapped out and gridded in its micro level detail. And here, just have a look at this painting for a minute, because I think it shows very clearly how perceptions of depth and the land are starting to change. Here we have a painting that, unlike previous paintings, and you can see here that the painter hasn't exactly done a great job of this, because the lines here don't work out very well. There's a mixture of two-dimensional and three-dimensional styles being used in this painting. If you look in the background, those images in the background are not very well foreshortened. But in the foreground, we see a very strong effort at using geometrical methods to create a foreshortening effect, to create a sense of depth in the battlefield. Look at the fallen lances on the ground. Look at the body of the dead soldier on the ground, and how the painter is trying to create a sense of depth. I think that's really fascinating. You can see the grid underneath the horse's feet, laid out by the lances that have been dropped on the ground. That to me hints at something that's going on here in our relationship to land in and around the 15th century, which is roughly exactly where we need to be in order to relate this point to the point made in the textbook. Here we have another image, this also showing very clearly the grid pattern of the modern spatial imagination, yeah? And you can see in the background a very strong sense of depth and gridding being developed by the painter. But what happens now, right? Because we may be leaving the era of globalization, we may be moving on to another era. Um, are we still territorial in this age of globalization? Well, the answer would seem to be yes. We still like the grid, we still live in nation states, but things do seem to be changing. Here in Ohio, during the Bosnian War, the warring parties were brought over to Dayton, where the Clinton administration took them out on top of a giant computer screen and had them walk around on this computer screen. They were able to use digital maps to create micro level adjustments to what they call the inter-entity boundary line. That was a border of sorts that was going to keep the warring parties apart. And it was a very finely tuned border in a way that was very strange in some ways, because the maps were so detailed, they were so high resolution, that the parties might have, in some instances, actually been walking, it could have almost been true to life, that they would have been walking around in a virtual representation of the real life border, which is just kind of strange, because it was all happening in Dayton. And even though they could have virtually been walking around in Bosnia, they were actually in Dayton. So it's kind of like this. I don't know if you ever watched Star Trek, and they have the hologram room where they can enter into a very real and convincing artificial reality. Well, I guess the provocation here is to ask, well, if artificial reality is today becoming more and more realistic, and our lives are becoming more and more virtual, in the sense that the artificial reality and the actual reality are overlapping with each other, then what does it mean to talk about geography? What does it mean to talk about virtual territory, virtual space, and how do those two things relate to each other? I think that's very, very interesting. So we have just a little more history here in the panel. I don't want you guys to feel like you need to remember these dates, because it's more just for your reference, but there's just a series of sort of pointers here in a timeline that talk about the emergence of the European Union as another form of spatiality that's being newly imagined. And you can actually sort of see the politics of this imagination being played out here in a way that's kind of interesting. From 1951, the establishment of the European Coal and Steel Community, just 6 members then. The expansion in 1957 to set up the Treaty of Rome, which is, of course, where the European Union, sort of European Economic Community, as it was called then, is established. Then we have 9 members, and in 1973, the effort to establish a single European market. We have in 1979 the first direct elections to the European Parliament. 1981 we have the first Mediterranean enlargement. 1993 the completion of the single market, and the 1993 also with the famous Treaty of Maastricht, establishing what we now today call the European Union. 1995 the EU expands to 15 members. 2002 we have the birth of the euro. The European countries, a lot of them now use their own currency. And then in 2004 an expansion again to now create what is the largest single market on the planet, which is in the European Union. And so if you can get your goods into the European Union, those goods have no borders to travel through. Once they're within the European Union, you just pay one tax, and that's at the European border, and then your goods are free to roam around within and be bought and sold within the European Union. So why are we talking about this? I think we were just talking about virtual community, and we were just talking about digital maps and that kind of spatiality, the complexity of imagining space today. But I think there's also another question, which is the way we as human beings feel about space today. We are in this digital age, and this age of Facebook and things like that. We're used to virtual connectivity. We're incredibly aware of the fact that distance isn't necessarily what do I want to say here? Tyrannical. People used to talk about the tyranny of distance as being something that would keep people estranged from each other. But in a Facebook era, in an internet era, in a virtual era, the the tyranny of space disappears to a certain extent, and the other is more close to you than he was ever before. So do Europeans then, in this digital age, find it easier to think about themselves as Europeans than they ever did before? Remember, in the last century, they've had several wars which have, left many, many people dead and families and lives destroyed. So it would be nice to think that a virtual era could produce a more conciliatory Europe. So hopefully that is the case. Hopefully we have a more peaceful European Union today. The last slide for this lecture. Do we have then what we call a post-territorial world? Some would say that we do. Some would say that the EU, the European Union itself, is evidence of an ongoing trend on a global level, which involves two things. First of all, deterritorialization, that is the lifting away of our identity, our passions, our loyalties from a given territory, a specific territory, and a super-territorialization, which is a sort of a re-territorialization of our loyalties and identity onto higher level super-sovereign entities, like the European Union, for example, for people in Europe. Although recently, of course, there has been talk about establishing a single market, or the beginnings of a single market between the European Union and the United States. So who knows what could happen there? Someday maybe the United States and the EU could be in a much closer relationship as trading entities, but that would also involve a certain politics. So that might be coming down the road in the next 100 years. You never know. Certainly none of us will be around to see it, but it's possible. I'd say it's probably likely, actually. So Manuel Castells calls this world the space of flows, right? And it's very different, right? Because we used to have a space of geographical enveloping, but now we have a space of flows. So what does that mean for us? Is it good or bad? What do we think? Super-territorialization then is this idea ultimately that the nation states in globalization may no longer be the appropriate vehicle to manage our politics, to manage our affairs, that the nation state really is a kind of a crude device, a crude nationalistic device, if you will, for thinking about, for example, complexities to do with global warming and that kind of thing. We may need to have authority above and beyond the nation state. So how do we manage this space of flows then, I guess, is the question Manuel Castells is asking us. If our lives are so deeply interconnected, if as Ulrich Beck suggests, we live in a global risk society where a nuclear meltdown in Chernobyl in the Ukraine can affect sheep farmers in Wales and in Ireland thousands of miles away, then we need to have a governing structure on the planet that's capable of addressing those complexities. And the nation states may not be the best, and to this date have not really been the best type of vehicle for that. Think about why nation states go to war today as well, and you see also the redundancy of the nation state, the fact that the nation state is an old vehicle. It's too much of a relic of the past, I think. Nation states don't go to war for reasons that nation states used to go to war, right? Nation states used to go to war with other states. They would go to war and they would wave their flags at each other, and one country or another country would be the victor. But today, nation states go to war to protect globalization, to protect the space of flows. They're looking for WMDs, they're pursuing terrorists. And these are actually new reasons for engaging in conflict that just didn't really exist before. So we have new challenges and new reasons, but we're still trying to use the old solutions. We still expect states to behave like sovereign powers, even though globalization has kind of limited the sovereignty of many of the nation states. In fact, all of them, even the United States to some extent. Our desire, our heartfelt desire in an age of globalization is to have so-called failed states like Iraq and Afghanistan express their sovereignty. But they're not doing it. And so other states are stepping in to sort of create sovereignty where where a gap in sovereignty might otherwise exist. So the question is then, is that a failure of imagination, that we're still trying to sort of refloat the old failed vehicle? Or is it a testament to the fact that territory is a lingering phenomena that still has a lot of life left in it yet? And that's something that we can't answer here, unfortunately, because obviously the future has not yet been written. But I think if you're interested, one of the people that you can look at to sort of answer that question is the writings of Hart and Negri. Their book Empire, I think, makes a very accomplished effort to try to answer some of these questions. So that's it for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and we'll talk to you soon.